Our last presentation is from a scientist who's on the front lines of studying how humans impact the ocean environment. Dr. Michael Gill recently has received his PhD studying healthy coral reefs and some of the stressors that impact them. And so he's here from the University of Florida to talk about how we can impact coral reefs, which I'm sure you'll probably talk about.
Go Gators!
That's right. Go Gators. We got a gator in the back. So thank you, Tyson, and thanks to Sailors for the Sea for inviting me to come speak to you guys, and thanks for sticking around till the end. I'll try to make this upbeat as much as I can, but it's kind of a dismal topic to some degree. So I've been fortunate enough to spend the past decade studying tropical coral reefs.
Where is that?
That's Pacific.
Pacific, yeah. Indonesia. Yeah. So clearly we can all appreciate that these ecosystems are breathtaking. And they inspire a lot of us. They clearly inspired me, and they actually inspired me early on to completely change career paths. I actually started at the University of Texas at Austin. Are there any Longhorns? There's a Longhorn, fantastic. So I started as a journalism major there because I wanted to work for National Geographic and had adventures all over the world. But my freshman year, I was given the opportunity to spend the summer here. This is Lizard Island, Australia. Some of you may have heard of it. So it's the island in the background there. And I lived there for the summer and spent my days in the reef, and I studied coral reef ecology, and I was hooked. And I immediately, when I got back to the States, changed my major from journalism to marine biology. And I hadn't appreciated at that point that the adventures I wanted from a career with National Geographic would be well fulfilled by a career in science. And they often include encounters with wildlife, like interrupting green sea turtles when they're eating seagrasses off the coast of Mexico in the Caribbean. And in this same location, being thoroughly examined by a loggerhead sea turtle. I'm supposed to have my speakers on. You could actually hear him hitting the camera there. And more recently, in Moorea in French Polynesia, I was lucky enough at the end of my field season to come across courting humpback whales, which you can see here, and those are spinner dolphins, which are sort of interrupting the courtship. It's hard to get privacy anywhere, it seems. And so this was a really fortuitous sighting because this was actually my final hours working on Moorea and my last day there. I had been working there for 6 years, so this was sort of like a lovely goodbye from the ecosystem. And my girlfriend is a marine biologist as well. Fortunately, she was behind me and was able to snap this photo, which gives you a little bit of an appreciation of the perspective. It makes me feel small every time I look at it. So coral reefs and the wildlife that they support are clearly inspiring. But coral reefs do a heck of a lot more than just inspire us. They provide us with a whole suite of ecosystem services, including fisheries, which support entire regions of people and actually serve as a primary protein source for entire regions of people. They also serve as important carbon sinks, which I'll discuss the implications of that in a moment. This helps offset the harmful effects of climate change. They also form developing economies. In Mexico, where I teach a field course every other year for the past 8 years rather, this is vital to the entire state of Quintana Roo, but to the entire country of Mexico. And the pharmaceutical industry stands to gain a heck of a lot from research from coral reefs. We've actually only touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of the potential for corals and all the organisms that live in these reefs to provide solutions to a wide variety of ailments, including cancers. More literally, corals provide barriers from waves that would otherwise be battering coastlines like we have here surrounding us. So clearly there are a ton of values associated with coral reefs, and so we really want to preserve these ecosystems. But to preserve them, we need to understand them. And to understand them, we really need to start with the corals themselves that actually form these ecosystems. And I found over the years teaching that the best way to describe corals is through Paris Hilton. So you may be surprised to know that Paris and corals that form coral reefs actually have a fair bit in common. Both of them are rich. Paris, of course, is rich in possessions. Corals are rich in the number of species that they support. They both have high net worth, as I just described to you. The corals translate to lots of dollars, more dollars than Paris, actually. They're both keepers of animals. Paris, her designer dogs. Coral reefs and the corals that support them, they support a wide suite of animals, which I'll go through in a moment. They're both undeniably colorful, as evidenced by these photos here. And a point I'd like to highlight is that they're both high maintenance. Okay? This is actually very important. So Paris needs expensive jewelry. She needs designer purses, designer dogs, and she needs designer dog food, of course, to be happy and to persist. Corals, on the other hand, they need warm but not too warm water. They need high light, they need high pH, and they need low nutrients in order to be happy and to persist. So they're both high maintenance, but why? Why are they high maintenance? Well, Paris was raised that way, right? Well, corals, it turns out, are the same way. So modern day corals that form coral reefs began to evolve about 65 million years ago, about the time that dinosaurs went away. So you can appreciate, if you've had an environment reinforced for that amount of time, you become quite set in your ways, which is what corals are. They're set in their ways. So we understand some characteristics and some needs of corals. But what are corals? This is often a point of confusion. So what is a coral? Is it an animal? Is it a plant? Is it a rock? So just hear me for a moment. By show of hands, how many people think a coral is an animal? Fair number of you. How about a plant? Okay, cool. How about a rock? Okay. Oh, okay. So some people are quite educated in here. You're giving away my punchline.
They keep telling me to shut my mouth.
Yeah. So if we zoom in, you're right on the money. So if we zoom in, we see that you're all right. Okay, you're all winners, which is great because this is actually a complex situation. So corals themselves, this is a coral polyp. It's basically an upside-down jellyfish. They're closely related to jellyfish. Anatomically, they're very similar. They're just upside down and they're sessile. They're not swimming around. They have tentacles just like jellyfish. They have stinging cells, nematocysts, just like jellyfish. And they grow in colonies. So there are multiple polyps on the colony, and these polyps are really special because they accrete a calcium carbonate skeleton that forms the structures on the reef that support all of these organisms that we so value. You're probably wondering where the plant comes in. So there is a plant component. It's not exactly a plant, but it's an organism that's very like a plant. So zooxanthellae are unicellular microorganisms that live within the tissues of corals, and they photosynthesize. So this is a really valuable friendship, which we call an ecology of mutualism, in which both parties benefit. So the coral provides nutrients through wastes and carbon dioxide through respiration to zooxanthellae that need these components. And zooxanthellae, in turn, they photosynthesize, they provide corals with sugars and with oxygen. And so this is a really important friendship, which you can actually see clearly when you zoom in on a coral polyp. These are zooxanthellae inside the polyp tissues, and they actually give corals those brilliant colors that we love so much. That's the zooxanthellae at work. And this friendship is so strong that it not only allows corals to persist in nutrient-poor conditions. All organisms need nutrients to survive. We use nutrients to create proteins and DNA. But in poor nutrient conditions, corals and zooxanthellae can persist through this partnership and this recycling of nutrients. And because of this persistence, they can support a wealth of organisms, and they can build these coral reefs that we see right outside here when you go out in the water. And these reefs support a suite of organisms, including a wide array of invertebrates, from urchins and sea stars, nudibranchs, clams, and a diversity of algae, to higher invertebrates like octopus and squid. I actually just saw a ton of these when I was snorkeling this morning, so check out our bay right here when you get a chance. Corals also support, of course, a wealth of vertebrates, including herbivorous fish here on the left, and coral-eating fish there on the right, and the predators that eat those fish, and the top predators that eat those, mesopredators, as we call them. And so, I would like to tell you that the big, diverse family lived happily ever after in the reef from that point forward, but that's not exactly the case. Because we humans showed up, and we tend to cause some changes. And that, as my talk suggested, I'm going to go through those changes point by point, just highlighting the ones that I think are particularly important to consider, beginning with local effects that we have, going into global effects, and finally, I'd like to end on a little bit of a positive note and talk about conservation, because we don't all just do bad things. There's a lot of people in this room that are trying to do good, and these efforts can make a difference. So beginning with local effects, I'd like for you to pretend for a moment that this is your front lawn. Now this is a sad state of affairs. It sounds like it'll be easy for some of you to pretend, because it's reality. So what might you do to improve this situation? I heard someone say fertilizer. If you said fertilizer, we're going to move on to fertilizer now. If you said fertilizer, you're not alone, because global consumption of fertilizer has drastically increased in the past 50 years from less than 10 million tons in 1961 to well over 50 million tons in 2011. Why? Because the nutrients in fertilizer can cause big changes, like making your nutrient-limited lawn, the former neighborhood embarrassment, flourish. And while you may need to spend your weekends plucking weeds from your now flourishing yard, this is change that can have cascading effects, like causing those annoying notes from your neighbors to suddenly disappear. Now, this is all change that works for you. But unfortunately, much of the fertilizer in your lawn will ultimately be flushed by rainwater into aquatic ecosystems like coral reefs that act as nutrient sinks. And this is true for fertilizer from yards and farms near coastlines, but also from human-generated waste from urbanized coastlines. And this waste is generally chock full of delicious nutrients. And so we know that nutrients can have harmful effects on corals by stimulating the growth of algae, which we also call seaweeds. And without a gardener to pluck these weeds away, these seaweeds can have a variety of negative effects on corals. As I mentioned, corals are high maintenance, right? So they can shade corals, denying them the high light that they need. They can also smother corals, preventing them from eating. Remember, they're like jellyfish. They also eat. They eat plankton. Some algae actually have spiky parts that can tear coral flesh away. And recent studies have actually shown that certain algae actually produce chemical weapons that they use on corals. So they use allelopathic chemical compounds that they synthesize specifically to kill their competitors, and they work. So algae can have a variety of negative effects. And so this indirect negative effect of nutrient enrichment on corals has been attributed by many to causing coral reefs in many places of the world to go from systems like this to systems like this. Big changes. You've probably seen this in the Caribbean. These changes can also have cascading effects, like your lawn. But in this case, it's not positive. It can result in the reduction of ecosystem services that we depend on. And so nutrient pollution can harm corals through algae. But fortunately, there are actually built-in controls in these ecosystems that can help control algae, like this guy, for example. This is a face only a mother could love. This is the aptly named parrotfish, one of many herbivorous reef fishes that eats algae on the reef, and in doing so has an indirect positive effect on corals. And so by removing these algae, they really kind of serve like gardeners of the reef. But to corals, they're really more like heroes, protecting the reef from too much algae. But where there are heroes, there are also villains. And overfishing can drastically reduce the number of herbivores in these systems. And so this can have a cascading effect, which we actually call a trophic cascade. Fishermen reducing fish to very low levels can indirectly stimulate algae, and they can indirectly harm corals, and tip the scales in favor of more algae and less corals. So we know that overfishing and nutrient pollution can both do this. They can tip the scale in favor of more algae and less corals, but they're not the only factors that can do this. The loss and fragmentation of reef habitat can actually have similar effects. And to explain this, I'm actually going to show you a classic example from the literature from terrestrial systems. We're going to take a break from marine for just a moment. So here are elk in Yellowstone Park. This is a forest field interface. And the elk can move into the adjacent field and capitalize on more resources because there's less elk there, there's less competition. It's more exposed. And by eating these resources, the elk can get bigger and stronger and have more babies in the future, potentially. But this additional exposure also welcomes predators to take advantage of the more vulnerable prey. And this can cause a great deal of fear. Nature is scary. This can cause a great deal of fear among the remaining organisms that are there. So landscapes can limit herbivory through fear, and this can certainly happen in marine systems like tropical coral reefs, which we know are highly variable across the landscape. Open sandflat habitats among coral patches are particularly exposed to predators. And so isolation from these reef habitats that provide structure could reduce herbivory. This could be really important. So I did an experiment to test how distance from reef affects herbivory, and I found a bunch of sites in French Polynesia that were characterized by this coral sandflat habitat interface. And I established 5 different plots. One inside the safe haven of the reef, which has lots of shelter to hide in, and then 4 plots that are continuously further away from that reef edge and further into this more dangerous habitat. And at each of these plots, I put out a nearly irresistible platter of algae, so a diversity of algae that fish would like to eat, to see how much their functional role of controlling algae may change with isolation from these refuge habitats. So just to give you just a quick look at what the experiment looked like in action, this is a typical herbivory event. That's Zebrastoma scopus, again, a specific species, eating some macroalgae from the 10-meter away from the reef site. And this little guy's lucky he wasn't there just moments later when this tough customer swam through. So risk was absolutely real in this environment for these fish. That shark could easily eat that fish. But even non-piscivores, non-fish eaters, could cause fear in this ecosystem, as evidenced by our recovery of this camera shortly after this fish had his way with it. And hats off to GoPro for building a product that can't break under triggerfish attacks. So to summarize the results from this experiment, again, we were looking across distances from the reef, and we saw about what we would have expected. There's risk out there, right? So herbivory overall declines as you get further away. So as you're more isolated in these sandflat habitats, herbivores are less able to control these algae that can hurt corals. But interestingly, we also saw that the individual bite rate of fish increased. At first that might make you scratch your head, but this actually falls in line perfectly with theoretical expectations across ecosystems that consumers should demand hazardous duty pay. If they're going to take on additional risk of feeding in a risky patch, they should demand higher energy intakes. And it seems that reef fish, they're not dummies. They're doing exactly this. And so a big take home here is that fear is powerful. This is certainly true in coral reefs, where fear associated with distance from the reef can change herbivore behavior. And in doing so, it can reduce the amount of algae that are consumed and thus indirectly harm corals. And so reef habitat loss and fragmentation, which is a problem all over the tropics, could weaken herbivory through fear, giving algae this competitive advantage. And fragmentation can happen via many, many things. Trampling, you've probably seen people do that in reefs. Anchor scarring, prop scarring, there's lots of things, wastewater effluent from power plants can fragment these systems. And so we see now that functionally they're more vulnerable to algal takeover. So we've gone through some local effects, but humans certainly don't just affect these systems locally, they also affect it globally, standards. And so the first global effect I'll talk about is carbon pollution. You should be familiar with this. This is the result of the burning of fossil fuels. Many of these fossil fuels end up in the atmosphere. And what this does, and what we have seen is that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased over 25% in the past 50 years, which is alarming because of what this carbon dioxide does when it gets into the atmosphere. So what it does, you've probably heard of the greenhouse effect, but this is how it works. These gases get trapped, sort of like a glass layer around a greenhouse, that's where the idea comes from, and they trap long-wave radiation from the sun, and this long-wave radiation can just bounce back between that gas layer and the surface of the Earth, causing global warming, not local warming. It's unclear what will happen at a local level, but globally, the world is warming. And so this can increase the temperature of the ocean, and through ice melt, by melting polar ice caps, this can increase the sea surface height. And we know that this can be bad for corals, because remember, corals, they're high maintenance, right? They need warm water, not too warm, and they need a lot of light. And so with more depth, there's more light attenuation. They can't get as much light. If they can't keep up with sea level rise, that could be a problem in addition to bleaching from the temperature itself. But a lot of people don't appreciate that much of the carbon that we put out in these burned fossil fuels ends up actually in the ocean. about 50% of it actually ends up in the ocean. And so this was a topic of an expedition that I was fortunate enough to be a part of in 2007. That's how I met Tyson Botinas. We were studying oceans and the carbon cycle aboard the SSV Robert C. Siemens, which is a 134-foot steel brigantine sailing vessel, which we sailed across the Pacific Ocean from Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, to Papeete, Tahiti, which just by coincidence I ended up working in Tahiti a few years later for my dissertation. But you can see here, this is as the crow flies distance. We covered a heck of a lot of ocean. It's about 6,000 kilometers worth. And we learned a heck of a lot along the way. First, we learned that sailing through the equator can lead to interesting air choices.
Really?
That was wicked.
Sorry about that, Tyson.
Tyson, that's good.
You guys are
Big attack.
You're seeing Tyson's dark past. More importantly, through our studies and through our research, we learned a great deal about how CO2 interacts with the ocean. In particular, CO2 reacts with water and it creates carbonic acid and it acidifies the ocean. That's where this term ocean acidification comes from. So this drives down the pH of seawater, and I already told you, high maintenance corals, they like their high pH, right? And they like their high pH because the carbonate skeleton that they accrete is based on pH. And the amount of carbonate in the water column, which is a critical component of the skeleton, decreases as the ocean acidifies. And so what we see is that the ability of corals to create skeleton can decline with acidification, and under extreme situations, acidified waters can actually dissolve coral skeleton. So this is scary stuff. It can certainly harm corals in the future. Of course, carbon pollution isn't the only kind of global pollution that we impose on these systems. You're all probably, being leaders in the sailing community, very painfully aware about the problem of plastic pollution. And so this looks like kind of a similar figure as what I showed you before. Plastic pollution, since the 60s, also on the rise. We're generating far more plastic than we're able to recover, and most of this ends up in the greatest sink we have, which is the ocean, through both littering, which many of you are fighting, which is very admirable, but in some cases we can't even control it because of natural disasters, like the Japanese tsunami, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so this led to a second expedition. Tyson and I also went on this one. This was in 2012. We sailed through the North Pacific subtropical gyre to try to get an understanding of what plastic was doing to the marine environment. We were again aboard the SSV Robert C. Siemens, and we sailed from San Diego, California, to Honolulu, Hawaii. Here in the white triangles are some of the sampling points from which we sampled macro debris. So the massive pieces of plastic that we found floating across, and I'll tell you what massive means in just a second. And just to give you some perspective, this red line indicates the distance from where that tsunami was. So this expedition took place 1.5 years after the tsunami, and we happened to be sort of timely with where we were going because this is where a lot of the debris ended up going. We're about 6,600 kilometers from where it happened, and we still recovered a great deal of Japanese tsunami debris, including this buoy. So this is a significant buoy because this was the first one we found, covered in Japanese characters. This was 800 meters off of the, kilometers off the coast of San Diego. Tyson remembers this fondly, he's next to me. And we're looking at this thing and we're like, oh my God, there's so much stuff on this. And so we're going through and we quickly realize there's a lot of organisms nestled within the barnacles. And so I actually have a paper that's going to be coming out shortly describing how these barnacles create structure like rainforest trees create structure. So even plastic that seem uninhabitable because of how smooth they are, like this buoy, they can become habitable through barnacle settlement. And what's very interesting about this is we found a worm on this plastic buoy that was only found previously in the East Pacific. Not that surprising. But we also found a crab that has only been found previously on the West Pacific, where Japan is. So this crab rafted across the ocean on this piece of plastic. So you might know what I'm getting at here. But before I get into that, just so you know, we could only sample certain size pieces of debris. It was a hazard to do otherwise. So this is actually the biggest piece we got. After we had cleaned it, this was also covered in leafless barnacles and lots of other critters. But we certainly saw more than the stuff we brought on board. We saw a refrigerator, which was actually full of Japanese food we pulled out of the freezer. This thing was covered in leafless barnacles. We also saw an overturned dinghy also covered in leaf barnacles. Both of these had fish swimming underneath them, crossing the ocean with it. So there's an elephant in the room, and that's species invasions. These plastics, these macroplastics, can absolutely transport species from coast to coast. We've already seen it happen. It's happening in Oregon now. There have been large pieces of floating docks that have landed in Oregon with species that have never been there before. And so they're not invasive yet because they haven't been set free and they haven't been able to grow and have detrimental effects on the ecosystems, but the threat is real. It could definitely happen. Well, unfortunately, it hasn't happened yet. Of course, we know in coral reefs, invasive species can be particularly detrimental, as evidenced by lionfish, which have plagued the Caribbean. And just a quick side note, lionfish likely were not transported over by plastic, but I'd like to just share with you a story that I think few people know, and that is the Nemo effect. Has anyone heard of the Nemo effect?
Yeah.
You have, okay. So the Nemo effect, this is just one way an invasion can happen. After watching Finding Nemo and feeling quite guilty, many people, we think in Florida mostly, where I'm from, dump their aquariums into the ocean to free their fish. But unfortunately they had exotics, including lionfish, and this contributed greatly to this invasion. And these lionfish may be beautiful, but they are potentially very, very problematic. And recent studies have actually shown that they can consume 80% of juvenile herbivorous fish that settle to reefs. Those herbivores I mentioned, how they're so vital to the system because they clean up algae, they can get annihilated by lionfish. So eat lionfish, please. They're actually quite tasty. So not just big organisms raft across. Recent work by Miriam Goldstein showed that these unicellular ciliates that cause coral disease can also raft across with plastic. She's found these on pieces of plastic. They literally eat coral tissue and skeleton. Obviously, that's a real threat to corals. And then plastic ingestion. I didn't want to share any of the really sad photos. This is still pretty sad, but there's some horrifying stuff if you feel like Google image searching this. But many organisms, many functionally important organisms in coral reefs ingest plastic that they cannot digest, and they die from digestive blockages. A lot of people don't know this, but most recorded sea turtle mortalities are due to plastic ingestion. So this is very serious. Perhaps even more serious for humans is the fact that plastics adsorb. What this means is they allow chemicals to stick to them, sometimes very toxic chemicals, including pseudoestrogens, which mimic human sex steroids. They can change the biology of organisms. We know that fish eat these, and we know that we eat some of these fish. This is not well studied. We don't really know what's happening, but the potential for this to be a vector for human genetic problems is very real. Just as a side note. Sorry, I'm saying some very scary things. So I'm happy to now move on to conservation, okay? So we went through some local and some global effects of humans, negative effects in particular, but it's not all negative. There are many efforts being conducted in conservation that can be helpful, and actually I feel like my work's already been done for me because of the talks that have already been given, and so I'll just highlight a couple key points, and in many cases I'm echoing what these guys were able to say so eloquently earlier. And I'm going to highlight key components to conservation, and one of them is stewardship, absolutely, which is a hallmark for Sailors for the Sea. So stewardship, by sharing a love and a connection to these ecosystems in a community level, you can cause grassroots efforts that actually influence government. Sometimes we can't resort to governments, right? Wayne just described that. Sometimes we have to do it ourselves, and that's how stewardship can make a huge difference. It's also really important as an environmental steward, and as you are all environmental stewards, to stress to people that sustainability and stewardship for environmental sustainability is not a partisan issue, it's a human issue. It has nothing to do with politics. This has everything to do with sustainability, including sustainability of the economy, as Tyson mentioned earlier. And sailors, as evidenced by all of you being in this room, you guys make great environmental stewards. Not only do you use such an amazing sustainable practice for moving, using the wind instead of burning coal, but you also travel across many nations. You interact with a wide diversity of people. You can spread your awareness, your love for these systems, your personal connections to these systems, and ultimately foster an interest in protecting these systems to a suite of cultures and people. Partnerships, Wayne also mentioned that, so partnerships are super valuable, both on the local and regional scale. I just want to highlight integrative coastal zone management. So this is an environmental management strategy that is often not taken because of the difficulty with which it is implemented, but the idea here is that we shouldn't be managing one ecosystem like a coral reef. We should be managing that system and the systems around it if we really want to make a difference. Because as I've already mentioned, terrestrial runoff from land can really have big effects on corals. So through partnerships among stakeholders, integrated coastal zone management can make a big difference, but it requires a lot of participation, and this is where stewardship can be really valuable. On the global scale, international partnerships are absolutely essential, and this is so true in the Caribbean, as the speakers before me have mentioned. This is largely also true because a lot of people don't realize that the larvae from coral reefs can be spread by currents across these nations. So you're actually all sharing a resource. So if not everyone is on board, one bad apple can spoil the bunch. So international partnerships are essential. And lastly, but certainly not least, is education. This is the first thing people need to make sure they have in spades when they start talking about the environment. And we really need to use science. So science, it lights an objective path to sustainability. But what a lot of people don't appreciate is about science, and what I've learned the hard way in the past decade, this being my focus, is that science is powerless without the people. If the people aren't engaged in science and they don't actually listen to what scientists say and use that to influence their decisions, science fails. It's just geeks playing and having fun and not having any real impacts. So we need the people, we need engagement. But science is often misrepresented, which makes this more challenging. And this can happen on both ends of the spectrum. Environmentalists can, in some cases, sensationalize issues like plastic pollution. You've probably read that there's a floating island the size of Texas made of plastic in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This is not true. This actually undermines reality, which I would argue, based on what I just told you, is scary enough. So I think Tyson always says, when you stretch the truth, you weaken it. I think that's absolutely true here. And on the other end of the spectrum, people with personal agendas that want to deny what scientists have come to consensus on, topics like global climate change, this undermines our ability to deal with these very real problems. So this all points to the need for everyone in the room to be critical thinkers. Think about the motivations and the credibility of the people from which you gather your information. And it's not just the people that need to do more work. Scientists need to do more work. Scientists, all too often, they collect data, they talk to scientists exclusively, and this is not enough, especially when we're talking about as timely of environmental issues as the ones I've been describing to you. And so, to this end, I recently launched a website, a mass science communication website, an associated YouTube channel with the series Confessions of a Marine Biologist, if you want to check it out. This is my small contribution to this very real problem of not engaging the public, and the public not really understanding what science is. Science is not difficult. Science is accessible, it's intuitive, it's meant to serve everybody, regardless of your background, your political affiliation, anything. So this is just one piece of the puzzle. Many other scientists are starting to get on this track, and we need this groundswell if we hope to use science to influence management and to help prevent changes like this from causing changes that make systems like this coral reef here, rich in biodiversity, to succumb to this algal-dominated, eroded reef that provides us with far fewer services. Instead, we need science-based policy that is enforced and it's supported by communities that allows for change that works for all of us, and in particular, humans of the future. We can't forget that entire cultures and regions of people all across the Caribbean and across the tropics depend on these ecosystems to survive. And in the end, we are all in this together. I think I'm right about out of time, so I'd just like to briefly thank Sailors for the Sea again, my buddy Tyson, for inviting me, some of my collaborators on some of the research I just highlighted for you, as well as Matthew Eklund, one of our shipmates, for the footage, and Sea Education Association and my other funding sources for supporting my research over the past 6 years. And I might have a minute to take questions, but even if I don't, I'll talk to you guys at the cocktail hour. Thanks a lot.